Hello, welcome to the Springfield City Library. In February 2017, the library's Civic and Community Engagement Team, along with the League of Women Voters of Springfield, Massachusetts, co-sponsored the program you're about to watch, Exploring the Electoral College. The Civic and Community Engagement Team's goals are to strengthen our partnerships with members of the community, to empower library patrons to engage with their government, and to create a forum for civic discourse that celebrates diverse voices. After the November 2016 election, people paid particular attention to the Electoral College. They questioned whether it was an outdated institution or an effective institution. The library's Civic and Community Engagement Team, along with the League of Women Voters, invited a panel of speakers, including a state senator and 3 professors with a range of interests and knowledge about the Electoral College, to come to the library and discuss its history and how it works today. I hope you'll find the program informative and will come into the library to explore the topic further. Thanks for watching.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate being able to be a part of this discussion. So I'm just going to start by providing a little bit of context by asking and answering a number of questions about how this Electoral College system works and with what consequences. So obviously, the Electoral College is a system of election for the president that's indirect. Instead of casting votes for president, citizens cast votes for electors from party slates, who themselves are pledged to vote for candidates in the Electoral College. And slates of electors are chosen by the party organizations within states. And how that's done varies state to state, but the parties do the work today. And of course, then those electors cast the vote for president. Now, importantly, in all but 2 states, the Electoral College works on a winner-take-all basis. That is, if you win a plurality of the vote, even less than 50%, as long as you win the most of the vote, you get 100% of the Electoral College votes for that state. So suffice to say that the Electoral College magnifies the effect of the plurality selection in the vote for the president. Now, the number of electors in a given state is equal to the size of the House of Representatives delegation, right, which is proportional to population, plus the number of senators. And so the Electoral College vote, by definition, works to the advantage of smaller states, because there are some states, like Wyoming, for example, that only have 1 representative but 2 senators. Now, you need 270 Electoral College votes to win, and there are 538 votes total. In principle, it's possible to have an Electoral College tie, although that's never happened. And if no one gets a majority of the Electoral College votes, the election's sent to the House, in which each state votes as a state and has a single vote. So that's how the system works. Now we might ask ourselves, why do we have this system, right? It seems a bit strange. Well, I think it's important to go back to the origins of this country to understand how they thought about presidential politics and presidential elections. So there essentially are 2 reasons why we have an Electoral College that operates the way that it does. The first is a virtually unanimous sense among the framers of the Constitution that the presidency needed to be linked to popular election or popular choice in some way, but not too closely linked, right? So on the one hand, the framers of the Constitution realized that the presidency in a country like the United States, it's not a monarchy. It can't be hereditary. It can't be a lifetime appointment. It can't only be selected by a tiny group of political elites. And they also didn't want selection by Congress or by state legislatures because they wanted the presidency to have some independence from those institutions. But at the same time, the framers of the Constitution were a little fearful that popular election, direct election by the public, would not be good for democracy. And so this is from Federalist 68. And you can kind of see an either or a both and here. So they say, it was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom so important a trust as the presidency was to be confided. But it was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation. In other words, the immediate choice should be made by a smaller number of people who knew what was in the best interest of the country over the long term. But it's also important to keep in mind a second reason that we have the Electoral College, and that was about the maintenance of slavery. So at the Philadelphia Convention, Pennsylvania James Wilson actually proposed direct election of the president by popular vote. But southern states didn't like that, and there was a very clear reason why. In a direct election system, the more populous northern states would always be able to elect their preferred candidate. The South would always be outnumbered. But the Electoral College formula drew on the allocation of representatives in the House of Representatives. And under the Constitution plan at the time, southern states got extra representation in the House based on 3/5 of each slave that was within that state. And so southern states were boosted in the Electoral College representation by virtue of the 3/5 clause for allocation of representatives in the House. So there is an aspect of our Electoral College history which is grounded in slavery and the South's maintenance of slavery. So how has the Electoral College changed over time? Well, the big change was its move from being an election by these very notable individuals who are electors selected because they were kind of great persons within their communities to it being a party politics. And the reason for this is simple. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr got the exact same number of Electoral College votes. Under our constitutional system at the time, it was unclear who was president under that system. And so it was thrown into the House of Representatives. There were 36 ballots. Finally, Thomas Jefferson is selected, and everyone realized that the original Electoral College system was a terrible way to elect president, and we needed to clarify that the votes for the presidency and the vice presidency have to be separate. Well, if you do that, then you make a pretty clear change in our system and create new incentives in which the race for the presidency becomes one of competition between two different and opposed forces. And so that system effectively reinforced and institutionalized the party system that we have today. So last thing before I quit, we might want to ask ourselves, how has the Electoral College functioned in history, right? We just had a presidential election where the Electoral College winner was clearly not the popular vote winner. Donald Trump won the presidency despite losing the popular vote by 3 million votes. And there's good news and bad news here. The bad news is that our system allows that to happen. And it has happened on 5 occasions, in 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and of course this year in 2016. The somewhat good news is that the other 53 times the Electoral College vote and the popular vote went in the same direction. So in terms of the popular vote winning, the popular vote and the Electoral College vote go together about 93% of the time, but, or pardon me, 92% of the time. But in 8% of the time, or a little bit more, there can be this divergence. So I'll stop there.
Woohoo, hello, thank you. Senator Lesser, who has some very public feelings about the Electoral College.
There we go. Thank you very much, Linda, and thanks to the panelists for being here. And I want to just give a special acknowledgement too, and a thank you to your city councilor who's here, Adam Gomez, friend of mine, and does great work, a great collaborator on a lot of topics. So. Let me first just say, you know, obviously this can get very politicized very fast. No surprise there. I filed my bill, you know, because there was clearly heightened interest around the Electoral College after this year's presidential election. But I do think for the purposes of this discussion and also for just good analysis of what we want to do moving forward, nothing is going to change anytime soon. It involves a constitutional amendment. It's a long way off. So I think it's important for the analysis to not just look at this election and not to try to plan or prescribe a plan based on what happened in 2016 or even in 2000. It's more
And
about...
to be clear, Eric, so everyone knows what it is that you filed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the bill I filed was basically a petition from the state legislature asking Congress to begin the process of a constitutional amendment. There's two ways to create an amendment to the Constitution. The first and the most common, in fact, the only way the Constitution has ever been amended is for the process to initiate in Congress. It has to go through the House, go through the Senate, and then it goes to ratification from the several states. The other way to do it is for, I believe it's 3/5 of the state legislatures to convene basically their own constitutional convention without Congress. That's never happened in the entire history of the country, although you can do that. There is a mechanism for doing that. So looking at that, I felt like the most sort of not easy, but the sort of smoothest way to get this started is to formally petition Congress to ask to begin the process. And this is fairly common. Actually, state legislatures have an important role to play in the Constitution, both amending it and updating it. And we fairly regularly, on a variety of topics, convene our own constitutional conventions for the state and also make requests of amendments to Congress. I would be remiss if I didn't mention one other item that's sort of percolating in Massachusetts right now and in a variety of other states, which is an interstate compact around the popular vote. It's gotten some attention, and Massachusetts passed it, I believe, in 2010 or 2011. What that is it's basically all the states on their own getting together and passing laws saying that they will bind their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. So what that basically means is that when the electors are chosen, they sign a commitment that they will vote the same way as the national popular vote. The idea is if you get enough states to commit to that, to hit 270, you've effectively ended the Electoral College. I support that initiative. I wasn't in office when it passed, but I certainly would have voted for it if I was there. There is one issue with that, which is it's entirely voluntary, and it's not a constitutional amendment. And I think as we saw from this year's election, when you have an entirely voluntary system, when pressure, that's exactly when you're most likely to see states withdraw or states change. So, ultimately, long-term and looking down the road, the way to change it and the way to kind of end the Electoral College, so to speak, is through a constitutional amendment. And I just close by saying this. As Jesse very articulately went through and very exhaustively went through the history of the Electoral College, something we need to appreciate is that the Electoral College is really nothing like it was when the Constitution was ratified in the 1700s. It's actually evolved multiple times, and the way we vote and the way we conduct elections has evolved multiple times. Senators used to be chosen by state legislatures, not by popular vote. The electors didn't follow. There was no real popular vote for president at all when the Electoral College first started. And we don't even have to begin to talk about women didn't have the right to vote, minorities didn't have the right to vote, and on and on. There's been quite a lot of changes to how our elections work and how the Electoral College operates and how our kind of government institutions work. So my feeling on this is it's worth taking a look at, every once in a while and asking ourselves, is the system that we have set up here, actually operating the way we think it should and the way that's best for the interests of the country.
Thank you. So, Professor Ahmed.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I was talking to a friend about how quickly this panel came together, and it was really almost a day that everything came together. And I joked that, the League of Women Voters is kind of like the elections mafia. When they ask, when they ask you to do something, you say yes. Not because there's any threat of violence, but because we all know what a critically important role this organization has played in, and continues to play in the functioning of our democracy. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
And as you may have already guessed, I am buttering you all up because I'm going to present a position that I suspect many people will not be happy with. Because it's my job today to defend the Electoral College, which I'm happy to do, because I do think it's an important institution that continues to offer benefits that often aren't recognized. And I think I am completely sympathetic with the concerns about the Electoral College and what is motivating the activity around this and the activism to potentially abolish the Electoral College. But I think that it's important also to keep in mind before we proceed that there are benefits within this institution. So I'm going to talk today, I'm going to defend it on 3 separate grounds. The first is selfish, the second is principled, and the third is pragmatic. So in terms of the selfish defense of the Electoral College, I think it really is important to emphasize that the Electoral College provides protections to minorities that would not be there otherwise. And really the important function here is not the discretion that electors have, because that's rarely exercised today, but what's more important is winner take all at the level of the states. And because minorities, particularly the Black vote and the Latino vote, tends to be critical in several really important states, that gives minorities a seat at the table that they otherwise wouldn't have. And people kind of think about, well, if we didn't have it in place, then cities would be important and minorities would still be protected in one way or another. But the truth is, if we get rid of the Electoral College altogether, then cities don't actually matter anymore. Geography doesn't matter anymore. Then it's really just aggregating individual votes at the level of the nation. And at the level of the nation, minorities are by definition a minority. The flip side of that, of course, is that you could potentially, conceivably, win the presidency with just white votes. I think it would be unlikely. But what's more problematic from my perspective is really the kind of campaigns this would encourage. And what Jesse mentioned, really, the institutions produce incentives. And so an institution, if you change to that kind of institution, then suddenly there are incentives to appeal to racial categories even more so than what we have today. So I think there are potential dangers, and so that's my kind of self-interested defense of the Electoral College, and one that I think the left in particular needs to be very cognizant of. The more principled defense, I think, really is just, I think it's a better system than one that's based entirely on the popular vote, which isn't to say it's the only possible or conceivable system. But for me, what it boils down to is the representation of individuals versus the representation of interests. And the representation of individuals is important, but it's not the only important thing. And I think maybe the reason I focus on this so much is I see what happens in other countries. I study democracies around the world, and I see what happens in other countries when you don't have a mechanism that mediates between the popular vote and the election in the way the Electoral College does. There are lots of other mechanisms that could do the same thing. But states in this system kind of serve as a proxy for interests. And of course, states aren't a perfect proxy for interests. They don't represent homogeneous interests, but they do have certain characteristics. So for example, if you win Texas, you know that there are certain interests you have to represent when you're in that office. If you win California, you know that there are certain interests that you have to represent when you're in that office. If you take that away, and you're winning your office, with a smattering of votes here and a smattering there, and really a much broader coalition, then what that essentially does is it puts more power in the hands of the elected official to pick and choose the interests they want. So because the interests haven't been aggregated and articulated beforehand, a system like that gives politicians much greater discretion in which interests they want to represent. When you have something in the middle that says, well, here are our interests, here we've aggregated at the level of states, people know, Massachusetts has this kind of characteristic, And if you're going to represent, if Massachusetts is going to be in your coalition, then this is what you have to represent. And I think that is something that is very valuable to have in the office of the presidency. And the Electoral College, with all of its faults, ensures that the winner of the presidency represents a broader coalition of interests than the loser does. It's not the only possible way to determine that mandate, but that's one way, and I can say more about that. So the final point I'll make, the pragmatic, is that it would take an extraordinary effort to repeal the Electoral College, to abolish the Electoral College, and Senator Lesser has already mentioned this would be a constitutional amendment. And I'm not saying it can't be done. And yes, all of our institutions evolve and change, and there may be ways to modify the institution or get rid of it entirely. But I sincerely believe that the amount of time, energy, money, attention that it would take to abolish this institution, I think Trump could have remade this entire country into his own, nepotistic oligarchy in the meantime. And so while we pay attention to this institution, I just want to make sure that we don't take our eye off of other things that are potentially equally important. And from my perspective, voter ID laws, which people talk about voter fraud all the time. From my perspective, voter ID laws that are popping up all the time, it's impossible to even keep track of them. They pose a much greater danger to democratic participation than anything else that we're facing. And the second point I'll make, redistricting. It is very, very difficult to get people excited about redistricting, but I do feel that that's where our attention has to be. The next round of redistricting happens after the 2020 census. We all know that. But the state legislators who will be in charge of redistricting are going to be elected over the next few years. And that's where I would want to put my energy, which is not to say that the Electoral College isn't important and it's, paying attention to these institutions is not important. It's just not a silver bullet. And I would hate to see people focusing on this unilaterally, thinking it's going to fix these problems of democracy.
Oops, sorry.
When there are other things also on the agenda. So I'll stop there since I think Linda is.
My beeper went. I haven't had a problem with the beeper for the other folks. I'm so sorry. And you gave us that nice compliment. So thank you. Let me just say before you begin, Adam, if anyone would like to sit, there are several visible seats right here. Now, everybody's good? Okay. Adam, thank you, Professor, for giving us some food for thought and bravely. Although I don't know, I mean, you're so thoughtful. I found that, your statements were certainly not hard to take, even though.
There.
Yes, thank you. I want to say that the League of Women Voters has, since the 1970s, had a position that the Electoral College does not allow for one person, one vote. And it is a historical position that the organization takes. However, I know from my conversations with so many of us that it is not a strongly held position by every single member of the League, and hence the opportunity to have these discussions is so important. And I think that that passage of time since the time that position was taken until now is it's just interesting to see how people have felt strongly at one time and how opinions have changed with the passage of time and other occurrences that put different lights on it. So now we will turn to you, Adam, to sort of pull this together however you see fit with your own comments.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I'll take the position of putting the proposal to reform, or I should say abolish, the Electoral College in a broader perspective. And I suppose if there were a title to what I would say, it would be Reforming the Electoral College, a False Solution to the Present Problem. So my position is that there is a real legitimacy crisis affecting America's political institutions because of their inability to adequately respond to the hardships, uncertainty, and precariousness affecting American citizens. This is not an existential crisis. There are no openly anti-systemic movements on the horizon with the capability of dismantling the constitutional system. But while there is no visible or feasible alternative in the works, American political institutions have reached record lows in public approval ratings. This generalized trend of diminishing popular legitimacy in the eyes of the public has not, of course, been helped by the prominent effects of archaic features of our constitutional system, as we saw in the results of November's election. And from a modern point of view that prioritizes political equality and democracy, these features, including the Electoral College, are, I think, illegitimate and should be reformed. My position on reforming the EC, the Electoral College, is that its fundamental problem is its winner-take-all mechanism of awarding an entire state's slate of electors to the winner of the state's popular vote, which, as I think Jesse pointed out, is operative in 48 states. In the name of democratic reform, state electors should be distributed proportionally according to the candidates' popular vote tallies. Such an alteration is theoretically achievable through changes made at the state legislative level rather than reforming the federal constitution, which faces insurmountable odds in the current climate, as Professor Ahmed also observed. The Interstate Compact Plan to bind states together voluntarily to cast their votes for the winner of the national popular vote is a plan that is, in my eyes, as patently undemocratic as the system it seeks to replace. Replacing one form of winner-take-all with another does not serve to correct the fundamental problem affecting American politics, the illegitimacy or the perceived illegitimacy of our institutions and leaders. So that said, reforming the EC, I think, is unlikely to address the root of the crisis threatening the American system now. While it's certainly true that a different electoral system would have produced a different presidency, the EC did not affect the outcome of congressional elections or the composition of state legislatures, which over the past 8 years have seen the Democratic Party almost completely wiped out. Just astounding losses at that level for that party, which has nothing to do with the Electoral College. As Jill Lepore, political journalist, recently observed, the Democratic Party is today an empty shell and has been for a long time. I want to make the case that the political parties, as the most malleable institutions in the American polity, deserve the most attention of reformers in the current moment. This requires long-term grassroots organizing, both inside and outside of the parties. It's going to take major renewed commitment on the part of party leaders and state and national party committees. But I think the popular disconnection and the long-term popular disconnection of citizens from American politics is the effect of not an outdated constitutional system, but the hollowed-out weakness of intermediary institutions that have for a long time taken a more market-oriented approach to activating and mobilizing those who are already on your side, rather than actually organizing people to become educated, responsive, and engaged members of our politics. This, I think, is much more a function of partisan failures, that the parties do not see themselves needing to play this role. Reforming the EC or even abolishing it would, of course, change the structure of institutions, change the structure of incentives, and may well make the parties behave differently. But I don't think it's just a structural outcome, and if it is in fact the case that reforming or abolishing the Electoral College is just completely inconceivable in this political climate, then I think it renews the urgency of entering the parties, getting the parties to behave in different ways, and take what I would call an organizing approach to politics. I'll leave it
All
there.
right, thank you. So I am feeling that there are some things just said that should be answered and reacted to by the panel, and obviously, Senator Lesser, I'm thinking you should go, being one of our younger representatives, senators, elected officials, and a Democrat.
So, yeah, so first I would say, I mean, I actually agree with almost everything that's been said. I don't think anyone is claiming that there's one solution to the challenges we're facing in our politics right now. I don't think anyone is claiming that there's a one silver bullet, whether it's something as dramatic as abolishing the Electoral College or something as relatively modest as things like campaign finance reform and better voter laws, which in the continuum, obviously those are big lifts and substantial, but compared to a constitutional amendment are more achievable. So I think this is more about having a broader conversation about what menu of things we need to think about and work on as a country to reinvigorate our political system. And I would not understate the role the Electoral College has played in producing a lot of that cynicism and dislocation about politics. I'll just give you just some real world examples of how this impacts our political system on the ground. In the last election, in the 2016 election, more than 90% of the candidates' time, Hillary Clinton's and Donald Trump's time on public events, so not fundraisers or private meetings, but public events, were in 12 states. In fact, I think 96% was in 12 states and 92% was in 7 states. The system we have right now arguably disenfranchises everybody else. How many times did we see those candidates in Massachusetts? The other thing I would add to that is it has very real consequences for governance. Because when you look at the quote-unquote swing states actually do get a higher proportion of congressional appropriations. They get more money on infrastructure. This has all been documented in academic papers. They also get higher share of federal disaster declarations, which should be very alarming to people when you think about that. It also distorts what issues get talked about. So issues that are important to urban America and to more densely populated places, and frankly, issues very important to the Northeast, things like rail or congestion or environmental issues, which disproportionately impact places with more dense populations, are missing from the national conversation. And just putting on my political strategist hat here for a second, that's a complete dysfunction of the structure and the incentives that are set up for these candidates. And if you change that, you'll see a corresponding change in behavior, because the function and the process is what forms the behavior. Before I was a state senator, I worked for President Obama for 4 years, and I actually traveled with him to 47 states in 2008 when we were campaigning for his first election. Traveled almost 250,000 miles together, over 200,000 miles. And I will tell you this, we did visit 47 states over the course of 11 months or so when you count the primary and the general election. But we spent the vast majority of that time in about 5 states. And I can still, to this day, 8 years later, recount with precision very small counties in Ohio and in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and in Florida. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what that means is huge swaths of the country in the Northeast, in the West, and in red states like Texas, were completely left out. I do think that what people need to think about is if it switched and if it went to one person, one vote, which is how every single other election in this country is conducted, and is how the Supreme Court over now about 50 years has reoriented basically every election. There was a time when state senators were not popularly elected in Massachusetts. They were voted on by county and by landholders per county. That changed after the Supreme Court started to say that those, that those rules disenfranchise certain people. If you move to a one-person, one-vote system, you would see the candidates compete everywhere, because a vote is a vote. And what that would mean is that they would speak everywhere and to everyone. And frankly, it can't be much worse than the system right now, because right now the system is basically that they talk to 7 states and they don't talk to anyone else, whether you're on the right side of the spectrum or the left side of the spectrum. So I agree that, often these reforms can have unintended consequences, and it's complicated. It's obviously complicated. I'm not trying to, be not trying to be simplistic about it, but I do think it's worth having a conversation. And while we work on things like redistricting, which I've worked on my whole career, things like voter ID laws, which I'm a co-sponsor of in the state Senate, things like working on gerrymandering reform, which are absolutely essential. Sometimes we got to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time and work on some bigger, broader projects while we're also working on some of those more short and medium term goals to make the system a little bit more responsive.
Thank you. So I do want to say that I know Senator Lesser will have to leave us. I hope you can stay for 5 more minutes.
No, I'm good. I have another thing and a baby at home. So.
Another thing and a baby at home. What could be more democratic? Right. So any other follow-up comments to this discussion here? Any questions for each other? Go ahead, Emma.
Okay, I'll take the bait while you're still here.
Thank you.
Sorry. So just a couple of things came to mind while you were speaking, and I know the statistics on how disproportionately candidates spend their time, presidential candidates spend their time, and even the allocations that go to these swing states. But I just wonder if that would actually change if we got rid of the Electoral College. I think the basic dynamic there is that candidates are going to invest money where they think swing voters are going to be. So even if it's not at the level of states, they're going to focus on certain municipalities more than others. I think there are other ways that you could, there are other mechanisms. If we're really looking at a broad menu of options, and Adam, you brought in other possibilities, if we're really looking at broad menus of options, then we can potentially also be creative with how the decision is made. So I've always thought, potentially runoff elections. If no one hits the 50% mark, you have a second round. And something that's useful to note that almost every time there's a discrepancy between the Electoral College and the popular vote, there is a third-party challenger that reaches a certain threshold. And that distorts the outcome significantly, just in general. If there were a runoff mechanism in place, that also brings more states into the discussion, because candidates have to look ahead. It's not just those 7 states that you have to win. It's whatever coalition of states would be necessary to put you over the top in a second round as well, because it's actually, believe it or not, it's fairly unusual to get over that 50% mark. That's just essentially how the math works out. The one other thing I'll quickly address is, one person, one vote, majority rule have such powerful rhetorical force. It's hard to argue against that. It's, these are founding principles. But I also want to emphasize that minority protections are also founding principles of this country. So I agree. It has been it's certainly been the trajectory of our country that more offices are elected through straight plurality decision rules, but that doesn't always produce more democracy.
Jesse.
So I guess I tend to come down. I tend to agree with Professor Ahmed on the issue of the pragmatics, and I guess I would also just point out that for me, I think it's really important to remember that the 2 elections in all of our lifetimes in which there were discrepancies between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, really, I think at the end of the day, can be chalked up to failures of enthusiasm and mobilization on the Democratic side. So in Florida in 2000, we're talking about a discrepancy. I mean, certainly the Supreme Court intervention adds a wrinkle to things. But we're talking about votes that were in the hundreds, right? So there are several hundred votes separated the 2 candidates. That's something where it's almost a random error, but at a minimum, it's something that Democrats should be doing a better job of turning out their voters. Similarly, in 2016, we've got a situation where 80,000 votes split across 3 states. If they would have gone the different way, Democrats win both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. This is something that that Democrats did not do a good job of in 2016. So, for example, in Florida, early evidence suggests that African American turnout comprised something like 12% in 2012 of the electorate and 9% in 2016. That's a serious problem. If turnout among African American or Latino voters falls by 3 percentage points, Democrats lose. The end. That's something where progressives are leaving willing votes on the table. So, and given that overwhelmingly the popular vote and the Electoral College vote go together, I guess I'm inclined to focus on the side of trying to fix institutions that mobilize citizens to vote rather than on making institutional shifts that are, it's an extremely heavy lift and it's difficult to do multiple things at once.
Is that your cue, your exit cue, Eric?
No.
Oh, of course.
I'm
The
just
only thing I
wondering.
was just going to say, I love that usually the elected officials, the being accused of being too pragmatic and the academics are too theoretical. I love the inversion. That's not normally. But a few things I would just point out. I tried in my introductory comments to avoid talking about 2000 and 2016 exactly because it's inevitable to get into a more partisan discussion. But that being said, I actually think the 2000 election perfectly proves my point, which is 535 people, or whatever the count ended up being, in Florida decided who the president was. And in this last election in 2016, exactly 80,000 votes spread over 3 states versus 3 million vote margin on the other side. I mean, I think anyone would take pause at that. I mean, you could acknowledge there's this reason or that reason, but the idea that that system is a democratic system is just not supported by looking at it. And so then the question then becomes, well, okay, well, is it worthy to protect and to continue for other reasons? And there's certainly valid reasons. I think part of the challenge here is that when the country was formed, it was formed as a collection of 13 states or colonies, and basically all through constitutional law over the last 250 years, 300 years, and through all of American history, we've had this yin and yang between thinking of our country as 50 independent states and largely looking at constitutional law and looking at election law through states as the units, versus an alternative view which views the individual people as making up a nation. And that gets a little technical, but that's kind of the prism to look at it. If you look at the country as mainly a collection of 50 independent units coming together to pick a president and to form a federal government, then you're going to be more inclined to support a system like the Electoral College. If you view the country as a collection of 300 million people that come together as a people to pick a president, then you're going to look more towards the popular vote. And what I would argue is over the last 250 years, we've shifted much more and more and more towards being viewed as 300 million people. That was the reason for underpinning the one person, one vote standard. That's the reason things like the interstate highway were created and all of these other issues. And that's also, by the way, what underpinned things like the 14th Amendment and the Commerce Clause that helped abolish slavery and provide public accommodation protections and the Civil Rights Act. So, I think we all agree. I mean, we can stipulate that obviously we've got to do voter ID laws and redistricting reform and gerrymandering and things like that first. But I would just kind of encourage people to really just think a little bit about whether this system is really operating the way it should and is creating the citizen participation that we want for something as important as picking a president.
Senator Lesser, thank you for your participation. We know you have to leave. We'll let you take your leave as you choose. And I'm wondering if anyone else would like to respond directly. I do have a question if no one has a follow-up to Eric. So I think it's fairly clear to me that there is great rhetorical appeal, as you said, the idea of one person, one vote. I am curious, and I do not know are there any other Western democracies that have anything other than direct popular vote? And if so, how does that work? Well, not well? Can anyone comment on that?
So I can speak.
I think it's your area.
Yeah. So there are actually a number of European democracies that have other mechanisms. They still value one person, one vote, and they're not weighting individual votes. So everyone still gets a vote, but it's really a matter of the decision rule. So one man, one person, one vote, one woman, one citizen, one vote is solid. It's really a matter of the decision rule. How do you decide who wins that one seat? Because at the end of the day, for the executive office, it's always one seat. If you have a larger pie, you can use proportional representation. But when you have one seat...
Can you explain proportional representation, just so we're really clear what we're talking about?
So, for example, if you take Massachusetts, Massachusetts was an easier example when we had 10 representatives, but now we currently have 9 congressional representatives. The math was easier when it was 10. But essentially, it's as if you took Massachusetts and erased all the districts, and everyone just voted usually for party lists for whichever party they preferred, and then the party would get a certain percentage of the seats, and they would identify the representatives. So in Massachusetts, if you had proportional representation, I think the breakdown in Massachusetts is around 60% Democrat, 40% Republican. So most likely we would end up with, instead of an entirely Democratic congressional delegation, we would have 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans or something along those lines. So you can only do that when you have multiple seats. If you only have one seat, if you only have one thing to give out, then the runoff elections are usually what most countries prefer, unless they have a parliamentary system. But runoff elections, France, for example, has a runoff for its president. So you have a first round of elections, and usually you have multiple candidates. And there it's easier to, you have multiple candidates because everybody knows there's going to be a runoff. The stakes are lower. It doesn't skew things as much as a system in the US where a third-party challenger really skews outcomes in all of the states, which is not to be down on the third-party challengers, but just mathematically, it's very tough to get a majority when you've got 3 parties competing. So in France, you have as many candidates as you want running for president. If no one reaches the 50% mark, then there's a second round of elections with the 2 top vote getters. And that all but guarantees that someone is going to get over the 50% mark. It gives people an opportunity to reflect on their choices and say, you didn't get your first preference candidate in the first round, who's your second choice? And it ensures that whoever takes that office has the confidence of the majority of electors in the country, which has both symbolic and political value.
So I see political scientists head nodding as the professor is talking, and I'm wondering what the other 2 professors are thinking about these kinds of alternatives. Do they make sense to you? And could you imagine that being efforted, any of those changes being efforted here?
I'll defer to you if you want to take a first stab at that one.
Yeah, from my own background in studying comparative politics, as an Americanist who looks abroad and it looks at other electoral systems, at first one is blown away by the other systems that are out there. The rationality to them, how often they're changed, they're relatively easier to change. The American case is a difficult one. The U.S. Constitution, the constitutional system, is one of the most stable, long-lasting of all the advanced democratic countries. Part of the reason for that is how difficult it is to change it. So it's a double-edged sword there. Are there other systems that I think would theoretically suit us better? Yes, I think so. PR for proportional representation for legislative bodies, for example, I think would be much better. However, I don't see much prospect for enacting those things here, which is difficult for me to say. I mean, I would like there to be some feasible pathway, but you're asking the very representatives who have a lot to lose in the remaking of an electoral system to remake that electoral system. And there have been moments in American history where there have been major changes. However, those conditions are rare.
Well, thank you. And I think that I might say, as a proud graduate of one of the 5 colleges myself, that the firepower that you bring, the seriousness and the depth of your consideration and your analysis makes me very optimistic that we will indeed see our way through this with our activism and your giving us firm underpinnings of at least research, if not fact. I really appreciate you for that, and thank you so much. Let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you so much.